Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Dr. Joseph Lane, and I'm really interested in learning science in the informal setting, or learning science, or basically anything for that matter, in a non-traditional place. This very short snippet of a presentation is titled Investigating an Informal Science Education Curriculum at a place called St. Helena Island in Michigan, USA. There are many things that are very important when we look at learning outside of the classroom, but perhaps the most important comes from Falk and Deckering back in 2010, when they essentially described that most of a person's science education actually comes from outside of the classroom. And that's simply because you spend at least 95% of your time outside of the classroom. Therefore, most of the actual information you retain will be coming from outside of the classroom, from a non-traditional source. So I took my interest to the state of Michigan. That's simply because it was where I was born, and it's where I worked throughout most of my younger years. So essentially, I will be examining how both teaching and learning can take place outside of the classroom, and in this case, on a guided educational tour. So, being the state of Michigan, you're surrounded by the Great Lakes. You're surrounded by fresh water. So, science education in the outdoor or the physical environment is really quite well suited. I will look at an island called St. Helena Island, and it is located in the northern part of the state of Michigan, separating the two peninsulas. This is St. Helena Island. This is an aerial view of the island taken back in about 2010. St. Helena Island itself is an uninhabited island that actually has a fully functional lighthouse along with all of the other dwellings that would be required to run the light during times of navigation back in the early 1900s. That lighthouse actually has tours. And people come from many different places to take tours of this island and of the lighthouse that is on the island. So again, this is St. Helena Island. And in this image, you can get a real small perspective of this little tiny lighthouse called St. Helena Island Lighthouse. So before we delve more into what this place, St. Helena Island, is actually like, it's important to note that the area or the region of St. Helena Island is a very popular tourist region. Mackinac Island is a very popular place for mostly people from the state of Michigan, but also people from all over the country or all over the world may in fact be going to Mackinac Island. So simply put, St. Helena Island is very close to civilization, but the island itself is very much isolated and very much an outdoor, rural learning experience. So that's St. Helena Island. Just give you an example here. This is the Mackinac Bridge. The Mackinac Bridge connects those two peninsulas, Upper and Lower Michigan, and it features basically an attraction in itself. It's lit up at night, and it can be seen very well from the island itself. So here are some more pictures regarding St. Helena Island. Once again, there is a lighthouse on the island. The lighthouse has been fully restored back to 1891 conditions. Here's an aerial photo of the island. The lighthouse is down here on the southeastern portion of the island. The interior portions of the island are pretty much low-lying swamp. There are a couple of trails in which the tour guides identified, but for the most part, the only human activity is found down here at the lighthouse or at the dwellings around the lighthouse. This is an image of the beach along the island. Again, it's completely forested, much of which is pine. So essentially, this is a brief description of a case study. On this island, youth leaders, teachers, people that are interested in history and historical preservation, they came and they restored this lighthouse from basically ruined, basically destroyed, back into a functioning, working, living area in terms of historical preservation and historical reenactment. So essentially, since the late 80s, there have been people involved in the restoration of St. Helena Island and its lighthouse. This particular study took place back in 2013, and as the researcher, I was interested in learning how the tour guides, the people that led tours on St. Helena Island, led tours of the lighthouse, how they may have incorporated science education or physical geographic education into their existing tours. So there were 7 adult tour guides, 6 of them were female and 1 was male. They were all volunteers for the organization in which the lighthouse was undertaken. The data collection period took place over 10 days in 2013. I, the researcher, was present the entire time, and essentially I was interested in getting data from the tour guides. I was looking for instances in which I could see meaning for the science education that they wanted to present. So what's important to mention in terms of this research is that data was kind of collected in an interesting way. First off, each volunteer tour guide was given a map. And on that map was St. Helena Island, they were essentially supposed to locate where they think they could potentially teach science. They'd mark that spot on the map. They would then take 3 pictures of that very same spot regarding the scientific feature of interest at that particular location. Lastly, they would take out a digital voice recorder and record their individual reflections as to what they thought would be the best types of science or physical geographic material that could be included in their existing tour. So after all that took place, there were also in-depth interviews that took place between myself and each individual tour guide. So here's one more example of how a tour guide would collect the data in regards to non-traditional learning in a non-traditional environment. The image here is an aerial photo of St. Helena Island, and the dot is where the tour guide was located. The tour guide took these 3 images. Now from this spot, the tour guide would be typically presenting about a village that at one time existed with about 250 people living in it right here back in the early to mid-1800s. So the tour guide already has a designed, specified speech that he gives at each location. We are simply examining where we could potentially incorporate science, physical geographic education into that existing tour. So what the tour guide found interesting is in these 3 images. And you have to look close to fully see what they are, but in fact, all that lush green stuff, basically where there's no trees, is all poison ivy. It's a very harsh plant that if you brush against, you can really get a nasty rash from. And the tour guide essentially would like to tell a story about how that poison ivy came to be there. It all has to do with the fact that land was cleared in this portion of the island for a pretty long time. And the trees have not yet been able to recover that particular area, and the poison ivy has set in and taken over everything. So that's just another example of tour guide data collection. Another example in terms of how the data could be coded is as follows. Essentially, I looked at accumulated life experience, or accumulated life experience as being an important part of the coding procedure, as well as the formal science background. So here's one last example of how science education could potentially be incorporated into an existing tour on St. Helena Island. Essentially, the lighthouse gives us a lot to go off in terms of engineering, in terms of technology. We can even look at the lighthouse in the form of angles of sunlight or lunar angles. So we have the actual lighthouse itself, and interestingly enough, that lighthouse provides very important weather and atmospheric data for people who are crossing this bridge. This again is the Mackinac Bridge. It connects Michigan's 2 peninsulas. It's a 5-mile stretch of bridge, so it's a really long bridge. And if you were to enter the lighthouse on St. Helena Island, you'd find this data collection box. And it's essentially All of the automobile traffic receives this data when they cross the Mackinac Bridge. They tell you wind speed, they tell you wind direction, they even tell you what a weather forecast could be as you go further south. So it's an important part of the existing technology that is used in the Straits, and it's being housed in a very significant historical location. So simply, to close, being inside this lighthouse, being in a very remote island, cut off from the rest of the world, you get a good sense of nature. You see how nature is actually a human construct, and in that human construct, we need to pull out the pieces that matter the most to us. So I'll close with sharing you an image of what is left of these lighthouses. Today, there are simply very small LED bulbs that blink inside the light. They each have their own specific code on the Great Lakes, so each light would essentially show you a different amount of blinks, and then you would know exactly where you are. A very good location on the island in which science education could easily be incorporated into an existing tour, and a really good example of what non-traditional learning is. So overall, the tour guides identified 5 separate places on St. Helena Island where they thought they could include science education in their existing tour. They took a total of 213 pictures. Had an example of some of them here, for instance. It's hard to see the view of the Mackinac Bridge from the island. This is a giant anthill. This is a large glacial erratic. So St. Helena Island, much like Perm, would be a glaciated landscape. So this glacial erratic, in this case, most likely came down from the Canadian Shield somewhere up by Hudson Bay. A total of 213 pictures were taken. And overall, the tour guides identified 67 different physical, geographic, or scientific features that they could potentially incorporate into their existing tour. So overall, the research found interest. People thought this was a cool thing, mainly because if the tour is already existing, adding the science to it is essentially something that the tour guides were very good at. So although the tour guides did identify 67 additional scientific features, they primarily focused on what they knew best, and that was history. So the history still remained the main focus for the tour guides, but the research did show that those historical tour guides had a pretty easy time incorporating science education into their existing historical tour. Thank you.